Greetings, friends. My name is Jose Aguto. I'm with the Catholic Climate Covenant, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Covenant's webinar, Communicating Climate Change to People of Faith. Before we get started, I would ask that you join me in a short prayer based on Pope Francis's words during this Lenten season, and then we will get on with our webinar. Most high, glorious God, during this Lenten season, we seek to fast from hurting words and to say kind words, to fast from sadness and be filled with gratitude, to fast from anger and to be filled with patience, to fast from pessimism and to be filled with hope, to fast from worries and to have trust in God, to fast from complaints and contemplate simplicity, to fast from pressures and be prayerful, to fast from bitterness and fill our hearts with joy, fast from selfishness and be compassionate to others, and to fast from grudges and be reconciled, so that we may do your holy will. Amen. And so today, this morning and this afternoon, we're delighted to have you join us and are especially excited to use this new webinar platform. My colleague Paz will be monitoring the question box in case you have any technical difficulties. So some housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending a link to the recording to you in the next few days. We will also have a question and answer session after the presentations. You can submit your questions by writing them in the question box on the right side panel of your screen. You may also wish to indicate who the question is directed to when you submit the question, either to Dan, DiLeo, or to Katharine Hayhoe. If you have any audio issues, it is most likely due to your Wi-Fi connection. You can try connecting by phone for better audio. GoToWebinar gives you the option to switch to the phone. Just click on the audio tab in the right-hand box. And with that, today's webinar will focus on how to communicate successfully about climate change within our faith communities, some of the key narratives and messaging strategies that have worked in the past, and the unique challenges and strengths within the Catholic community for successful climate communication. And so I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter, Dan DiLeo. He is an assistant professor and director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University. This is his first year. His research focuses on Catholic social teaching and climate change, with a particular focus on Pope Francis's ecological encyclical Laudato Si. Since 2009, he has served as the consulting project manager at the Catholic Climate Covenant, and it is an absolute delight and privilege to work with Dan. His passion for this is so apparent, and we are just blessed to have him at the Covenant. The second presenter, I'm delighted to introduce Katharine Hayhoe, who was named to Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World in 2014. Katharine is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and is best known to many people for how she is able to bridge the broad, deep gap between scientists and Christians, work she does in part because she's a Christian herself. She has written several books on climate change and is also, in 2012, was named by Christianity Today as one of the 50 women to watch, and in 2014 was awarded the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize and named one of foreign policy's 100 leading global thinkers and 20 women making waves in the climate change debate. And so with that, I'm pleased to hand it off to Dan DiLeo to start his presentation, and then followed by Katharine, and then followed briefly by Dan DiLeo afterwards, upon which we will have questions and answers. So Dan, I leave it to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jose, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As Jose said, I'm now a professor at Creighton University, but a few years ago, I was finishing my graduate work at Boston College. And there I had the chance to interact with really a world-renowned climate scientist who said something profound that has stuck with me ever since. So we were talking about the challenges of working on climate change in the US, and he said very simply, in many ways, it's not really about the science. It's about how the issue is communicated to different Americans. And at the time, I was blown away by what he said. He's a climate scientist saying climate change isn't really about the science. And he could tell I was confused, and he went on to say something to the effect of, we've known the basics of climate science for 150 years. Scientifically, we know everything we need to fix this problem. Now, it's really more about communicating our message in ways that inspire people from different backgrounds with different sets of beliefs to take difficult action together. Essentially, he was saying that solving the climate crisis really comes down to communications framing. And if pause, you could move to the next slide, please. In the social sciences, to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item described. That's a fairly technical definition. In other words, a communications frame establishes the way an issue is presented to an audience and can influence how the audience receives, understands, and engages the information presented. As we know, climate change can be framed in a lot of different ways, as a scientific issue, as a political challenge, as an economic issue. Among the many possible frames, though, there's a growing amount of research which suggests that religion and morality are frames that can inspire climate change action, both among people of faith and among people of goodwill. And if pause, you could move to the next slide, please. So in the Catholic tradition, the various principles of Catholic social teaching can serve as planks which frame climate change as a moral issue in ways that can move people of faith and people of goodwill to take action. For example, we can emphasize that climate change implicates our commitment to protect human life by recognizing how climate change causes an estimated 150,000 annual deaths around the world, and recalling the pointed question from Pope Benedict XVI. Pause if you could move to the next slide, please. In 2010, Benedict asked, quote, "How can we separate or even set at odds the protection of the environment and the protection of human life?" Similarly, we can highlight that climate change challenges our commitment to protect the poor and the vulnerable. Pause if you could move to the next slide, please. Since, as Archbishop Celestino Migliore observes, quote, "It is the poor and the powerless who most directly bear the brunt of environmental degradation. Unable to do otherwise, they live in polluted lands, near toxic waste dumps, or squat in public lands and other people's properties without any access to basic services." References like these to Catholic commitments regarding life and the poor are just some of the ways that Catholics can work to frame climate change as a moral issue in ways that might compel people of faith and goodwill to take action. And as Jose said, today's featured presenter, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, is a widely acclaimed expert on climate change communications with particular expertise about religion and faith. So now it is my very distinct honor to turn things over to Dr. Hayhoe.
Hi, Catherine. This is Jose. Are you on? Or perhaps you're on mute?
Yes, I am here. I'm sorry, my connection had just dropped.
Ah, very good. Great to hear from you, Catherine.
Okay, let me just start my webcam here. All right. Okay. Just making sure that you guys can see me all right.
Yay, delight to see you. Hello.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction and that great framing for this presentation. How we talk about things really is not just as important, but almost more important than what we talk about. So what I want to do is I want to, let's see, I want to share with you some of my own thoughts on this topic. And hopefully, let's see here. Okay, can everybody see both me and the slides? Everything look good, Jose? Okay.
Yes, I can see you.
All right. And you can see the slides too, correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So when we're talking about climate change, we're often bombarded with messages like this. Climate change is not a science, it's a religion. Or the problem is Al Gore has turned this thing into a religion. Or God's still up there, the arrogance of people to think that we human beings would be able to change what he is doing in the climate is, to me, outrageous. When we see people say things like this, often our first instinct is, let's get the Pope to set them straight, right?
Right.
It isn't only about our faith, though. In Hebrews, it gives us the definition of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And as a scientist, I always kind of wish I was there back then when the author was writing Hebrews to jog their elbow and say, hey, you forgot the second part of the verse. You got to talk about science too, because science is the substance of what is here and now and the evidence of things that we can observe. And if we look just at this past year, we have definitely seen things that we can observe that are telling us that this thing is real. The destructive impacts of Hurricane Harvey remain months after it originally hit Houston back in the summer. There's still 1 million people today, this headline is from December, but there's still 1 million people today in Puerto Rico who don't have access to electricity yet since Maria hit in September. When we looked at headlines at the end of this year, they talked about coral bleaching and record wildfires and the fact that last year was the hottest year on record without an El Nino. When the Prime Minister of Dominica spoke to the United Nations late last year, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth we have just lived. So at this point, we might say, people's eyes should set them straight. We don't just need the Pope. People should just look around at the world and see what's happening, right? Unfortunately, it's not so simple, because even though our eyes are telling us there is definitely something going on, and even though, of course, we know that the Pope and many other religious leaders have amazing things to say about climate, we have not seen the impact on public opinion that we might have hoped. So this is just one very short extract from the Pope's enormous encyclical that is full of good things, where he talks about how global warming is being caused by enormous consumption. And he links this issue of climate change directly to an issue that is near and dear to all of our hearts, which is the issue of injustice. The fact that those of us who are producing this problem or contributing most to the problem are the ones who are not suffering the most. In fact, quite the opposite. It isn't only the Pope. Even evangelical leaders have issued strongly worded statements, and this one comes from 5 years ago already, talking about how God's creation is groaning under the weight of our uncontrolled use of fossil fuels and how the negative consequences will fall disproportionately on the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed. Our leaders, our faith leaders, are speaking out, and you can find similar statements from the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. You can even find similar statements from the Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist faiths. We all know that in the Bible, it talks about our responsibility. And I love this version of the Bible because I like the way it puts it. This version's the Message. It talks about how God said, let us make human beings in our image, so that the reason given here for making people in God's image is so we can be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. And this leads us, of course, to the metaphor of stewardship, where when you look at a piece of land and it is well taken care of, it is profitable, it is fruitful, it is performing well, and then you compare that to lack of stewardship. Everybody instinctively knows that whoever it was who was in charge of or responsible for this farm did not do a good job, right? But it's about more than stewardship too. Because when we look at which countries are suffering the greatest impacts from a changing climate, they're the countries where people are already suffering from other issues. Issues like hunger and poverty, lack of access to clean water, and diseases that no one should be dying from in 2018. The reason why I care about a changing climate is because it is the greatest humanitarian challenge we face today. We could be pouring all of our money and prayers and efforts and hope into this bucket to try to fix poverty and hunger, injustice, disease, but there's a hole in the bucket, and the hole is climate change. And that hole is getting bigger and bigger. We have to fix the hole if we're going to fix the other issues that we already care so passionately about. And we know that the Bible has lots to say about this too. This is just one verse from 1 John that talks about how if someone who has worldly means sees a brother or a sister in need and refuses them compassion, how can the love of God remain in us? We're supposed to love not only in word and speech, but in deed and truth, by helping, by doing, and by acting. In Ephesians, Paul picks up this theme and continues it by talking about walking in love as we were already loved, a sacrificial love that gives to others. And of course, there's always the Texas version of the Bible. It's printed on road signs. And I like this one, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. So you might say, okay, well, clearly this will make a big difference. I mean, if you, and this is a survey from a few years ago, but I don't think the results will be too much different today. If you ask people, how concerned are you about a changing climate? Well, you know, right up at the top, Hispanic Catholics are the most concerned people group in the entire United States about a changing climate. And that is good news. But on the bad news side, if we look down at the bottom, we've got white Catholics and white evangelical Protestants neck and neck for the least concerned people group. This shows us that it isn't our theology. It isn't what we say we believe. It isn't where we go to church on a Saturday night or a Sunday morning. It isn't that that's determining how important we think this issue is. So when we're communicating about a changing climate, first of all, we need to confront the real problems. What is it that is really causing people to say this isn't a big deal? Is it what the Pope is saying? No, what the Pope is saying is right on. Is it what many evangelical leaders are saying? Is it what the Bible says? No, the Bible's right on, and many, not all, but many evangelical leaders are right on too. The real problem is the fact that we are living in an increasingly politically polarized society. Back in 1994, this is what the political landscape looked like in the United States. Democrats, Republicans, very close together, most people in the middle. And then now, 2017, it's the opposite. We've got most people out at the extremes, and people are very far apart. Why does this matter? Because the number one predictor of what people think about climate change, social scientists have found, is simply where we fall on this political spectrum. The further we are to one side or the other determines how serious we think this problem is. And we saw this when they surveyed voters ahead of the election a year and a half ago. Is climate change human, natural, or not happening? There was a stark difference between people who said they were voting for Trump and people who said they were voting for Clinton. That's the number one predictor of what people think. Now, let's get back to that extreme weather. Remember the Prime Minister of Dominica who said that to deny climate change is to deny the reality we have lived? So one of my favorite social scientists, a guy called Larry Hamilton, after Harvey, after Maria, after all those crazy hurricanes and floods, he polled people. He didn't poll people living specifically in, Houston or Puerto Rico, but he polled people around the US who were aware of what had been happening. And he said, does recent extreme weather add to the evidence of climate change? And then he asked people, would you call yourself, a liberal or a moderate liberal? If they did, about 80 to 90% of people would say, yes, it does. Then people who were moderate were about 50-50 on this. And then people who are conservative or moderately conservative were about 25 to 35% would say yes, which means the rest would say no. So even the evidence of our eyes fails to convince us when we're confronted with an issue that is so politically polarized. And in fact, Larry went on and he did something else that was very local. Back in January this past year, the state of New Hampshire had an unusually warm winter, one of 5 unusually warm winters that they had had in the past 2 decades. And so what Larry did was he actually asked people, do you think this past winter was unusually warm? And guess what happened? In their own backyards, people's answers to whether they thought the winter was warm fell out along political lines. So unfortunately, we've reached this crazy point where what the Pope says is not enough, and what our own eyes are saying is not enough either. The most dangerous myth we've bought into is that we have to be a certain type of person. We have to be very green, very liberal. We probably bike to work and wear Birkenstocks and eat granola. We have to be a certain type of person. And if I'm not that type of person, then I don't care. Or even worse, I can't care, because that would mean I wouldn't belong to my community, to my social group, to my tribe, even possibly to my family. What's the second most dangerous myth we've bought into? So often we tend to fixate on how many people think that this thing is real. This is an amazing set of maps from the Yale Climate Opinion Forum. So if you're looking for these maps, you can just Google Yale Climate Opinion and they will pop right up. We fixate on a map that says, how many people think global warming is mostly caused by humans. Look at those large blue areas where less than 50% of the people would say, yes, we need to fix that. We need to give them more information, maybe some printed booklets, maybe some videos they could show during the service. But this is not the darkest blue map that there is. A much darker blue map is, do you think global warming will harm you personally? Turns out nobody thinks it will harm them personally. Except if you see a couple of those little orange counties there, who lives in those orange counties? Hispanic Catholics. So the second greatest myth we bought into isn't that it isn't real, it's that it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter, why would we talk about it? Why would we want to do anything about it? Because the number one symbol of this issue for most people is a polar bear. And hardly anybody has ever seen a polar bear in real life. I mean, seriously, have you seen a polar bear in real life, in the wild? I would bet no more than 2 or 3 people on this entire webinar, perhaps not even that many people have. If this is the number one symbol of a changing climate, why would we care? Even if it is about people, often the images we're presented with are of people who live very far away from us, who have no relevance to our lives in places that we've never been. Low-lying islands in the South Pacific, or Native American or Inuit tribes in the poles. When you ask people, do you think global climate change is a serious problem? There's a big difference between Democrats and Republicans, a 48-point difference. But when you go on and you say, are you concerned that climate change will harm me personally, or it's harming people now? Those numbers are uniformly lower for everybody. That's the real problem. So the second most dangerous myth we've bought into, after I'm not that type of person, is it's a distant issue. It doesn't matter to me because it's only going to affect future generations or people who live far away. So now that we've confronted the magnitude of the problem, let's talk about the solution. How do we talk about climate change? What can we do about this thing, given how it is one of the most politically polarized issues? And if the Pope can't even make a dent, he can make some dent, but it's hard to make a big dent. And actually, new studies that was just presented at a meeting I was at this past week showed that the Pope's encyclical actually ended up polarizing people and splitting people apart and decreasing some people's trust in the Pope, if you can believe that. So if the evidence of our own eyes doesn't work, if an encyclical doesn't work, what does work? How can we talk about issues that are so polarized? I'm going to give you a template. This template is based on thousands of conversations I've had, as well as a great deal of social science research. The first step is to start with something that we share, that we have in common. The second step, if we need to, is do any explaining then. Don't start with the explaining, and explaining is really optional. But continue on by talking about solutions. Because even if we think that we care, even if we're convinced that we care about this issue, if we feel like there's nothing we can do about it, why would we even care? I mean, if there's nothing we can do about something, we just dissociate, we disengage, we think, well, I would love to help, but there's nothing I can do, so let's move on, right? Why waste emotional energy on something that I can't fix? Talking about working together to tackle this problem is absolutely the most important thing we can do. So let me give you examples of each of these 3 things so you see what I'm talking about. Okay, bonding. What values do we share? Now, some of these may sound trivial, but the whole point is to start a conversation from a place of a shared value or concern or love or care, no matter how trivial it is, as long as it's important to us. Could it be fishing? I used to fish a lot. Or hunting, or birding, or hiking, or skiing. Could it be the fact that we're both parents? I spoke at the Rotary Club a couple of years ago, a group of very conservative business people in West Texas. And as I walked in, I saw this sign, the four-way test. So I looked at the sign, I thought, yeah, this is climate change. I mean, is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? Absolutely not. Would it build goodwill and better friendships and be beneficial to fix it? Yes. So I reorganized my whole presentation along this four-way test while everybody else was eating their chicken lunch. And then I presented the four-way test on climate change. And at the end of my talk, one of the businessmen, a local bank owner, came up to me, and I'll never forget the look on his face. He was completely bemused. And he said, I never really thought there was anything to this whole global warming thing, but it passed the four-way test. As in, I can't not say it's real now because it passed the test. Why did that work? It worked because I was using his frame of reference, his values. In the United States, over 75% of people, and across the world, over 85% of people, belong to a faith tradition. And every single major faith tradition in the entire world has at its core the concepts of stewardship or responsibility over the planet and caring for those who are more vulnerable or less fortunate than us. That is one of the big things that we have in common. And the bottom line, too, this is a picture of where I live in West Texas. The bottom line is we all want a safe place to live, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, enough food to eat, a healthy economy where we and our kids and our family can get a job. Just about every single person on the planet has the values they need to care about climate change already. We just have to figure out what those are through asking questions, conversing, getting to know them. And then we can connect the dots to climate. Let me share from my heart with you why, as a mother, I am very concerned about a changing climate. Let me share with you as a Christian, as a former missionary kid, why I'm concerned about how climate change will affect the poorest among us. Let me share with you from the perspective of national security, why I'm concerned and what the military has to say about this. Let me share with you from an economic perspective. As a fiscal conservative, let me talk about how we have some serious issues to confront. We start from a place of shared values, and then we connect them to a changing climate. If we need to do any explaining after we've connected the dots, then we can do some explaining. Yes, it really is real. It's us. Scientists do agree. It matters because it affects us by exacerbating the risks we already face today. What do those risks look like? They look like stronger hurricanes along the Gulf and the Atlantic coasts. They look like wildfires burning greater and greater areas as beetles eat our forests in the West. It looks like what used to be permanently frozen ground thawing and crumbling literally under people's homes up in the Arctic. Or it looks like increased risk of heavy precipitation and flooding in the South. We can explain these things. We can explain how we've always been prone to billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, and this is how many of these we've had since 1980. Yes, Texas is number one, but we care about a changing climate because it takes these risks and it exacerbates them, it amplifies them. Speaking to Hurricane Harvey, we've found out that somewhere between 15 to 40% of the rainfall associated with Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if we had the same hurricane 50 or 100 years ago when the world wasn't as warm. Because in a warmer world, more water evaporates, so there's more water vapor for a big storm like Harvey to sweep up and dump on us. Climate change didn't cause Harvey, but it exacerbated or amplified it, increasing the amount of rainfall associated with Harvey, and of course, also increasing the area flooded. But lastly, we cannot end without talking about how we can work together to fix this problem. And the number one thing to remember when we're talking about solutions is it's not about being afraid. This is what I love is we have this litmus test in the book of Timothy, where Paul writes to Timothy and says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. So if you feel a spirit of fear, that's not from God. What God has given us is power to get things done, love to care for others, and a sound mind to make good decisions. We're also told that there isn't a specific thing that everybody needs to do. The metaphor that is used for us, for the church in the Bible, is that of a body. Each of us has a different role. Each of us has a different ministry. Each of us has a different expression, something that we've been given that's different. Each person is given something to do that shows who God is. Everyone gets in on it. Everyone benefits, but it looks different. So I can't give you 3 steps that everybody should do. I can't tell you one thing that if everybody did it, that would change it. The answer is there's no one silver bullet, but there's a plethora of things that we can all get in on to help fix this problem. And one of the first things that we can do, may surprise you, it's talking about it. Did you know that when they asked people around the whole US, do you hear somebody else even talking about this issue? 75% of people said, oh, maybe no more than a couple of times a year or never. Nobody ever talks about this issue. Why? Because it's contentious, it's politicized, they're afraid they're going to start an argument, and it's depressing. So let me give you some talking points that are not depressing, that we can talk about. We can talk about how people are taking sensible steps to prepare for a changing climate, whether it's putting in drip irrigation in West Texas to be a lot more conservative with our water and save money, or whether they're building floating villages in the Netherlands. So if sea level rises 3, 5, even 8 feet, so what? You buy a few more feet of anchor chain and you're done. That's pretty cool. We can talk about that. What else can we talk about? I love talking about what's happening in Texas. The fact that Fort Hood, the biggest military base in the whole US, decided to go with wind and solar over natural gas last year in order to save taxpayers $165 million. That's a pretty cool thing to talk about. I love talking about how we're always breaking records in Texas. By the end of 2017, we ended up at 18% total because the fall wasn't as windy as the spring. But every year we're growing in the amount of wind energy that we generate. There's entire towns in Texas that are going with solar and wind. And Georgetown, which is a small town north of Austin, they decided to go green because 3 students from the local college in the business program ran the calculations and made a pitch to city council on how they could save money. That's a pretty cool thing to talk about. We can talk about how solar energy is being used to end energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, where hundreds of millions of people are living without any energy, but they have access to enormous amounts of not coal. They don't have any coal. All those people who say, oh, you evil environmentalists are preventing people from developing using the fossil fuels we used. They don't have those fossil fuels. They don't have massive deposits of coal. With the exception of Nigeria, they don't have massive deposits of oil either. But I tell you what they do have. They have massive amounts of sun. And so we can talk about how this can be used. This is a map of all the solar energy around the world. We can talk about how we can use God's gifts to us, wind and sun and tides that will never run out, to help end energy poverty and invest in people's lives. That's a great thing to talk about. We can talk about what we're doing ourselves as well. One of the first things we can do is step on the carbon scales, measure our footprint, because how would you know how much weight to lose if you don't weigh yourself? How do you know how much carbon to lose if you don't weigh your carbon footprint? And then we can talk about what we're doing. We might talk about, hey, I actually changed all my light bulbs. I was speaking at a Baptist college this weekend, and there was a woman in the talk who said that she had watched a video that I had about talking about climate science earlier that week. And after she heard the video, she went home and she changed every light bulb in her entire house. Now, light bulbs are kind of the proverbial, oh, I changed a light bulb, so now I'm done. But the reality is, once we feel like we're part of the solution, then we feel like we can do even more. And if every home changed just one light bulb to a new LED that just costs a couple of dollars now, that would be like taking nearly 1 million cars off the road. It would save $250 billion in energy costs. One church, their youth group, decided that what they were going to do is offer a service to senior citizens. It's really hard to change your light bulbs when you're older. It's scary to get up on a ladder. You're afraid of falling off and breaking your hip. So the youth group decided they were going to help senior citizens. They were going to change any light bulbs they needed changing, replace them with LEDs, so that first of all, the seniors could save money because they use a lot less energy. And second of all, they don't have to be changed as frequently. That was the way that their youth group decided to minister to their church congregation. Another thing we can do is eat lower down the food chain. The less meat we eat and the less beef we eat versus chicken, the less chicken versus fish, the more we save. One of my favorite organizations is called Climate Caretakers. I love it because it's an online Christian community, and that's what we do best, is networking in community. So you sign up online, and every month they send you a suggestion of something that you can do, not just you by yourself, but everybody in the Climate Caretakers community is doing it that month. You really should check it out, climatecaretakers.org. We can encourage each other to personal action. We can work together for corporate action, like this church that offered their roof to the community as a solar panel garden, because it's a lot cheaper to put one set of big solar panels on one big roof than a bunch of little sets on a bunch of little roofs. What a witness to the people living in their community. Or Houghton College, a little college in upstate New York where it's actually pretty cloudy, to put in the biggest solar panel array of any educational institution in all of New York, even though they are only a small Wesleyan college with 1,200 students. We can make our voices heard through organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby that has over 70 Democrat and Republican members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is amazing. Or through faith-based organizations like Micah Challenge, that's based on the idea that we should walk justly, like Arasha, which is a conservation organization, and of course, can't leave it out, the Catholic Climate Covenant. These organizations help us make our voices heard based on the values that we have and the faith that we share. So how do we talk about climate change? We can do so by bonding over our shared values, by connecting them to and explaining why climate change matters, and last of all, by finding ways that we can work together to act. Because the bottom line really is this: the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was beautiful and inspirational. We're blessed to have you, and hope you're available for questions. But first, wanted to have Dan provide some reflections, and then I'll pass it off to Paz to run the question and answer session. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Katharine. I think so much of what you said resonated with me, and I think with my colleagues at the Covenant and with folks who are attending the webinar. I think just from a Catholic perspective, I think there were a couple of things that really especially resonated with me. The first was that first step in your sequence of progression, the bonding and connecting. That's literally what Pope Francis means, I think, when he talks about the culture of encounter. That has been a staple of his papacy, and it's something that is a thread woven throughout Laudato Si, this idea of individual and corporate change coming through authentic encounter with other people. And I think that's such a difficult thing, especially in this politicized environment, to be able to have those authentic encounters with people. And it takes time, and it can be uncomfortable, but I just underscore everything that you said in that step, especially because I think that's just so important. And then I think the other thing that I heard as a Catholic that resonated was when you talk about inspiring people to act, and at the end you mentioned both the individual and the corporate. And in the Catholic tradition and in Catholic social teaching, we talk about the 2 feet of love in action, charity and justice. And charity is those are the local actions to encounter people one-on-one, to minister to their immediate needs, and that's hugely important in the Christian life. But the 2 feet of love in action require that charity always occur with justice. That is to say, attention to the systems and the structures and the policies that make charity necessary in the first place. And so, yes, it's wonderful for us to take local immediate actions, but if it's really going to be an adequate faith-based response from a Catholic perspective, it has to occur in concert with justice and political advocacy and things like that. So I so appreciated everything that you said in that regard as well. So so much more we could talk about. Your work is just absolutely fantastic. It's a gift to the church, both capital C and lowercase c, and I'm just so grateful for everything that you've done. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, this is Paz Artaza Regan. I will be moderating the Q&A section. Before I get started, though, I do need to let both presenters, both Katharine and Dan, know that the question section is replete with thank yous to both of you for your presentations. So I will be focusing on the questions, but do know that there's a lot of comments there. Before also, do know that the recording will be sent out to everybody who attended. It will also be on our website in a couple of days. A PDF version of the slides will most likely also be up on our website. So to get started with the questions, this is a question for Katharine from Alexandra. She wants to know if you would have one video, a short video that you would recommend that could be shared with her evangelical friends that would encapsulate all the issues that you talked about. What would be the one video you might be recommending?
Yes, well, I think this video could be shared with Catholic friends also. The number one video I would recommend is the most popular episode from our Global Weirding series. So I have this little series called Global Weirding with PBS that is all online. It's on YouTube. You can find it if you just Google Global Weirding, or it's also globalweirdingseries.org. And of that series, of all the videos we've done, the most popular one is the Bible doesn't say anything about climate change, does it? That is the most popular video. The Bible doesn't say anything about climate change, does it? And of course, the Bible doesn't mention climate change, but it has lots to say about our attitudes and our actions and our response. So if I were going to share one video, that is the video I would share. It's about 5 minutes long, doesn't take long to watch, and it really puts into a nutshell the common values that we as Christians share that I think provide the foundation for caring about a changing climate.
Great, thank you, Katharine. And I did write it in the question box so folks can have it there as well. This question comes from George, and George wants to know what ways are there, the best ways to work around the polarization? I believe you spoke about it in your presentation, but if you would possibly sort of summarize the top couple of ways to work around the polarization on climate change.
Mm-hmm. The number one way to work around it is to work around it, exactly. So if someone comes at me and literally confronts me with, you know, that's just a liberal issue, or it's just a natural cycle, or, you know, some type of thing that we've heard like that before, my response to them is, it's important to say no, but then my response is to go around and say something that they would not expect, that focuses on our shared values. So you might say, no, and I love the way that Genesis talks about how we're responsible, we're stewards, we have dominion over this planet. Do you agree? And depending on who you're talking to, you know, pick something that you think they would agree with, and they might say yes. You know, or you could say, I think it's amazing that we got 18% of our energy from wind in Texas, and it's got 25,000 jobs. Don't you agree with that? And they might say yes, but what does that have to do with what I'm talking about? You say, well, you know, that's the solution, or that's our attitude, or that's the reason why I care. And if you feel the same way, well, then I think you would care too. Let's talk about it. So whatever you can do, the most important thing to do is start a conversation, or take a conversation if they start it. Either start it or take it as soon as possible to a place of shared values. Whatever those values are, if you don't know what they are, ask questions to find out what they are. As soon as possible, take it from we're different to we're the same. And then once you've talked about how we're the same, then you can share from your heart how you care, why you care, and obviously why they care too, because they share the same values as you. That conversation goes a very different direction than starting from a place where you're emphasizing what divides you rather than what unites you.
Amen to that. This question is for both Dan and Katharine, and I think that you may have a different take on how to answer it. So when I read you the question, perhaps Katharine, you want to go first, and then Dan. The question is, when one is speaking to or communicating with the ministers and the staff of the church on one side, and then communicating with the congregants, the parishioners on the other. How do you do it differently when it comes to having them take concrete actions? So how do you talk differently to the church staff and to the congregation parish folks? Katharine first.
I'm not sure that we'll have different answers. Let's see. I'm curious. When I've spoken to church leadership, our conversations usually focus around what can we do as a community, as a body. What can we do in terms of conserving our resources and presenting a good example to the people in our congregation? So we focus very much on communal action, whereas when I'm talking to individual people, we often tend to focus more on our attitudes and our responses, our personal responses to those attitudes. I don't know, Dan?
I think that's good. I think what I would emphasize is that the approach is similar, but the message may differ. And what I mean by that is echoing Katharine, beginning with an encounter and meeting people where they're at, so to speak, and finding out what the concerns of the staff are versus what the concerns of the parishioners are. And using that as the entry point to then have the explanation and the inspiration. So, for example, parish staffs, I would assume, are probably concerned about saving money, for example, that can be used in other forms of ministry. And so, if that's a real concern of the priest or the council or the CFO, you can talk about how saving the parish energy or increasing its energy efficiency can save money that can then be used to hire a pastoral associate or to expand youth ministry. So I think that's a way to meet staff. And then I think meeting parishioners where they're at entails the same things that Katharine has been talking about in terms of finding out what are the things that they're concerned about. Are they concerned as parents, as educators, as business people in the community, and being able to meet them where they're at and then go from there. So I think the message may be different, but it'll come from the common approach, which is the culture of encounter, I think.
Yes, and you both had good angles on how to answer that question. Here I am putting together several questions because they all seem to be on the same wavelength. And they're described this way. How would you start a conversation with a Republican senator like the ones you had in your first slides, Katharine? And how would you then act when talking to a completely skeptical person? And I'm putting them together, the Republican senators and the completely skeptical persons.
That's a great question. So first of all, I want to highlight the fact that we often tend to put people in kind of a black and white yes and no categories, like either they're yes or either they're no. What the Yale Climate Communication Forum has shown, and again, they're the people who did those public opinion maps I showed, they showed that actually we fall more into a spectrum that they call the 6 Americas of global warming. And of those 6 groups, the groups at the very end are the smallest. So the dismissive people, the people who will dismiss anything, and I would put a couple of politicians, not too many of them, but I would put a couple of politicians into the dismissive group. That's only 10% of the population, just 10%. After dismissive comes doubtful and then disengaged. Then we have people who are cautious. So they're not totally sold out, but they're cautious. Then you have concerned and alarmed. So the vast majority of people that we talk to, we might think that they're dismissive, but most people aren't. Most people might be doubtful or even cautious. And so if someone is truly dismissive, the way I think of a dismissive is, my personal definition is, if an angel from God appeared from heaven with a brand new set of tablets of stone that said global warming is real in letters of flame on them, and that would not be enough to convince them, then that person is a dismissive. A dismissive person is not going to be convinced by anything we say. If they are a politician that we have to work with to get something done, the most important thing to do is jump right from bonding to inspiring. Hey, let's bond over the fact that we want a healthy economy for our district. What would bring us a healthy economy? Well, I've heard there's more jobs in the solar energy industry now than in the coal industry. Did you know that the Museum of Coal Mining in Kentucky put solar panels on the roof? Did you know that per kilowatt hour, local investment in wind and solar produces 8 times more jobs than natural gas? Let's talk about how we can bring economic prosperity to our district. That's a great argument that skips right over the whole, climate change, is it human, is it happening, why do I care thing. So with the dismissive, even an approach like that might work. But with anybody else, the best thing again to do is to start again with shared value. Now that value might be the economy, that value might be our kids or our health, it might be a specific, we care about the butterflies migration in San Antonio, or we care about the Baltimore Oriole in Baltimore, or even we care about our sports teams. It was so funny. My husband is a pastor, and one of his friends, he's a pastor, just texted him yesterday. He said, I was listening to my favorite sports program on the radio in Dallas yesterday, and they were talking about your wife's work and about how climate change will affect outdoor sports like football and baseball. So no matter who we're talking to, figure out what makes that person tick, even if they are a dismissive politician, figure out what makes them tick, and then start there.
Thank you, Katharine. This question, I think I am going to put up for Dan. Dan, would you have recommendation of sources of Catholic, traditional Catholic sources, where folks can find information of what the church fathers, saints have had to say about climate change? And I would think that our website, but you may have other places as well.
Yeah, so I would say immediately, I would say the Catholic Climate Covenant website. We've got citations from obviously Francis, but from Benedict, from John Paul, from the U.S. bishops going back all the way to 1983, from bishops around the world. There are several different books and resources that that touch on this, and I think what's most important to emphasize here is that this is nothing new for the Catholic tradition. And I think that's so important because there's a sense that what Francis is doing is somehow radical or it's new. And if it's radical, it's dismissive. But Francis is building on what John Paul II said in 1990 and what the U.S. Bishops' Committee said in 1983. So this is nothing new for the Catholic Church. And I think starting at the Covenant website and then being able to identify some of those primary sources, some of those primary documents, is really helpful, especially in speaking to people who, who have a proclivity to want to appeal to the authority of the church, to demonstrate that this is something that is deeply rooted in the tradition of the Catholic Church.
Yes, and I'd like to add that if anybody ever has a question as to finding a source or some material, just email us and we'll be glad to point you in the right direction. This question is one of those hot button issues in some places. I'm going to read it to you as much as I can. It's rather long, so I'm going to be summarizing it. And this question is about the pro-life issue. And it's when we're discussing climate change, we often experience that counter argument that comes something like this, that if we care about life on this earth, why aren't we fighting abortion? And the person here is asking, how do we stay on message on fighting climate change, but also wanting to not dismiss the legitimate concerns and values of people that they're speaking to, the folks that are caring about pro-life? How do we talk about either separating the issues or being respectful on both issues while still focusing on climate change alone? Who wants to take it first, Katharine or Dan?
I would actually love to
Go
start,
ahead,
and then I want Dan to follow up. So that is a great shared value to bond over, because life does not stop at birth. It continues. And if we are pro-life, it means we are pro-life all the way from the very beginning until the end of the life. So one of my favorite organizations is called the Evangelical Environmental Network. And they specifically say climate change is a pro-life issue because obviously it affects maternal health, it affects babies in utero, but it affects all of our lives throughout our entire lives. And again, like I said before, climate change is one of the greatest humanitarian challenges we face today. It affects people. It is a pro-life issue. that is a great place to start the conversation. Dan?
I would echo all of that, and I would follow up by pointing out that advocacy isn't all or nothing. And what I mean by that is I think we tend to, like Katharine was saying, put people in boxes, that if somebody, identifies with one ideology or one party, that they are across the board towing the line on every issue. In fact, support for one or another policy doesn't mean that you can't support or oppose a different policy on some other issue. And so if you're speaking with somebody who identifies as, a person deeply committed to, what we might call the anti-abortion, that's wholly consistent with the church's social tradition, and that's wonderful. But that doesn't mean that that person can't at the same time advocate in support of, say, the Clean Power Plan, which the US bishops have repeatedly done over the past several years. It doesn't mean that they can't ask their legislators to support US contributions to the Green Climate Fund or support of the Paris Agreement, which the bishops have consistently done again over the past several years. So I think it's important to emphasize nuance in advocacy, and to recognize that supporting one issue or one particular piece of an issue doesn't mean that across the board it rules out support or opposition to different pieces of legislation.
Excellent, thank you. Because of the time, I think we have time for one question, maybe two. I'd just let know folks that if we don't get to your question, we will get to it individually through email. This question is, I think for both of you, but perhaps Dan, you might want to start with it. Do you think that encouraging the local priests or bishops in the area to be more active on this issue would have a similar impact as what the Pope did with Laudato Si, or could it be potentially divisive?
I think the church is local and the church is global. I mean, that's getting into ecclesiology, but the parish is the center of the church life for people in the local community. And so I think it makes total and complete sense to reach out to the priests, to work with the local parish council, and in social sciences language, kind of use a top-down and also a bottom-up mode or model of approaching these issues, because I think for so many people, their encounter with the church is on Sunday at their local parish. And so I think that's the perfect place to start. And that's the place where some of these operations and catechetical approaches can really be lived out, that parishes can make the autonomous choice to put solar on the roof or to integrate creation care into their youth ministry. So I think the local parish is absolutely a perfect place to start. And as Katharine keeps saying, I think the approach is to meet the priest or the pastoral associate where they're at, emphasizing the continuity of all of this within the Catholic tradition, as I said, going all the way back to John Paul II.
Katharine, do you have anything else to add?
No, that's good.
Okay. Okay. Well, this last one, it just came to me here, so I apologize that the last one is probably a contentious one as well. And this one is related to pro-life, but it is with the complementary issue of consumption and population. And how do we address population growth in relation to climate change, carbon footprint, while reconciling it with our pro-life and values? Which
well,
one?
Actually, that happens to be the topic of our most recent Global Weirding episode. So we love tackling contentious issues. Do not ever apologize for a contentious question. Those are the most interesting. So our latest episode is on the myth that, isn't the solution to climate change population control and everybody going vegan? That's the myth. To find out the answer, you're gonna have to watch the video. You can find it on YouTube, or if you go to my Facebook page, Katharine Hayhoe on Facebook, you can see it. That in a nutshell, though, the answer is that it isn't so much the number of people as how we live. The quote I used from the encyclical actually emphasizes this exact point. It is the massive overconsumption by a small fraction of the population. If we had, if we only had 1 billion people instead of almost 7.5 billion people on this planet, but those billion people were us in North America and Western Europe and emerging economies that are using a lot of fossil fuels, it would make no difference to the climate getting rid of the other 6.5 billion people. This is an issue of justice, and that is why one of my favorite solutions to climate change, there's this great book called Drawdown that goes through all of these really inspirational solutions to climate change. If you're looking for talking points, Drawdown is a great place to start. And one of their top 10 solutions is education of women and girls. Because the more educated a woman is, the more likelihood her babies have of surviving to childhood and then adulthood, the better the job she can get, the better able she is to support her family, the less children she ends up having, not because of any control program, but simply because we're giving people the ability to choose and to help their children live rather than die. Dan?
Yeah, I think this continues to be the issue, and I know we're over time, but this continues to be a contentious issue. And I think to underline what Katharine said, I think Naomi Klein, who was essentially helping the Vatican roll out Laudato Si, is a secular, self-identified secular Jew, and she talks about the population issue as a distraction to addressing climate change, because at the end of the day, it really is about drawing down the consumption levels and the emissions of the world's most affluent populations. So it's really, I think, misplaced energy to be focusing on kind of the contentious questions rather than on the solutions that we have right now and the obstacles to implementing the solutions.
Great. Thank you to both of you. And as I said, we will try to get to everybody's questions individually. Jose?
Thank you, Paz. Thank you, Katharine and Dan, for your inspiration, your knowledge, your wisdom today. We are so grateful and blessed to have you on. And also want to thank everyone for joining this conference call, and hope it's been enlightening for you as well, and that we can all move forward together as one body of Christ to create a better world for ourselves and for future generations. So thank you so much.